Welcome to the Startup Grind.
Please join me in giving a warm hand to Chet Kanojia. All right, Chet, is your mic working?
I think so, yeah.
All right, awesome. This is not your first time doing Startup Grind.
No, it's not, yeah.
Yeah.
Second or third, I think.
Yeah, so we're excited to have you back. I went and watched the old video from 2 or 3 years ago, and we had mic troubles right at the start, so I think we fixed that this time around. We're really excited to have you. The last time you were on the Startup Grind stage, it was as the founder and CEO of Aereo, and in the last few years, you've been through several ups and downs. I wonder if we can start just with why don't we start with a poll from the audience? How many people have heard of a company called Aereo before? Raise your hands. All right, so half, maybe 2/3. There's been a lot made of everything that Aereo did, but maybe we can just quickly talk about what Aereo was and give a brief background there.
Sure. That's why I have bourbon. Aereo was a company that started in 2010, 2011. It was launched commercially in 2012, and we created a technology that allowed people to get over the top, to get television, broadcast TV over the top with a network DVR built into it. And it was wildly loved by consumers, as you can imagine. You can get it on any device, and equally wildly hated by the media companies, as you can imagine. And in a record time of, I think, 18 months from launch, ended up in the U.S. Supreme Court, and we had won all the way through to the Supreme Court, but we lost in the Supreme Court, and that was the end of that.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, it was Justice Scalia who wrote the dissenting opinion in favor of Aereo.
Right. Very few times I've agreed probably with Justice Scalia, but I shouldn't say that. You go through this process, you sort of become like I was fascinated with the process, and in fact, when I was starting the company, somebody recommended a book which was called, I forget the title, but it was about Cornelius Vanderbilt. And in fact, he was the founding case. He went to the U.S. Supreme Court as a start, and it was a founding case in antitrust law that was about against the Hudson Boat Company or Hudson Ferry Company or whatever it was. He and his partner sued them because they argued that the New York State's grant of a monopoly to the Hudson River Boat Company was illegal, and they won.
Interesting.
So I started getting into this. That tells you how early we knew where we were going. Yeah, so it was fascinating. And I sort of started reading opinions, and it's sad that he's passed on, but it was an incredible writer. Just a lot of us probably don't agree with necessarily the outcome of the position he took, but from a legal perspective, the analysis was just spectacular. And as an American, the idea of constitutionality is a pretty powerful thing.
So, excuse me. True to form, I'm going to ask if you can adjust your microphone a little bit.
Sure. What do you want? Move it up?
Yeah, I think that's a little better.
Okay, great.
Pointing with there, I think that should work.
Okay.
Great. Yeah, well, right from the start of Aereo in 2012, it seemed like you were very clear in public in saying that you thought there'd be multiple legal challenges to what Aereo is doing.
Right.
So it seems like you had sort of a few years even leading up to the Supreme Court case to think a lot about what the implications of Aereo were in a legal context. But let's just go ahead and dive into what you're working on now. So I believe it was roughly 3 weeks ago you officially announced the launch of a new company called Starry. I wonder, first of all, if you can give us a basic description.
It's I think even more transformative than Aereo was in success and failure. Fundamentally, the approach that we're taking is we think internet access or broadband access or connectivity is going to be a really important thing for both the United States and the world at large. And if you take a step back and say there is no competition in the marketplace today for access providers, right? So wherever you live, and we all actually live in very generous areas where you tend to have 2 or 3 choices, but vast majority of the country and the world tends to be stuck with 1 or 2. And the big reason behind that is the cost of constructing a network, building a network is just incredible. It costs you about $2,000, $2,500 a home to connect a home, and not a whole lot of companies, including Google, have that kind of money to do that. And that's not just a money problem. In addition to that, the time it takes to build these networks is just insane. So the payback period is even further out. So we created a technology that lowers that construction cost using wireless technology, and in particular, ultra high frequency, which is called millimeter wave parts of the spectrum, which are largely unused, to be able to do gigabit level internet access. In addition to that, and this is something that came out of our Aereo experience, where in-home Wi-Fi, in-home connectivity is severely challenged. And I suspect the vast majority of the people here are reasonably technical, so they understand how to fix some of that, but a vast majority of the country in general, or the world, doesn't, they just want things to work, right, and simple and easy.
Sure.
And nobody has really cracked the code on how to make it easy and simple to just kind of make connectivity within the home work, along with newfangled things like Internet of Things, which doesn't mean much to an average consumer, except they want, a smart lock, or they want something just easy and simple. So we decided that we were going to, the Valley calls this like full stack company, which is basically we create a proprietary, our own technology, spectrum that's layered on top of it, direct to consumer service, and the purpose behind it is so that we can actually transform the experience. And by transforming the experience, it comes with great features, simplicity, all those things, but also at a price point that actually makes sense. And it's a personal thing for me where whenever I see inequity in terms of what a product and service should cost and is actually sold for, is just because there is a regulatory framework that permits highway robbery is just kind of like, irks me. And it's not just a financial thing, it's a customer experience, service, how people are treated, so.
Yeah, well, I mean, as a consistent entrepreneur, you must see opportunity at the same time, right?
Exactly. So you see this as a tremendous part of opportunity because it's a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity, globally speaking.
Sure.
And so it made a lot of sense for us to all get together and go at it. And so when we started, we basically took the entire principal engineering team from Aereo and the principals in marketing, communications, government affairs, because we knew this was going to be a big effort again. And we started with a co-founding group of 25 people.
Wow, that's.
If you think you have co-founder problems,
So
I actually have none.
I mean, how did you get 25 people to come along on this ride with you?
I'd like to think it was my charm and personality, but I think what it really comes down to, I think when you have sort of a really moving shared experience like Aereo was for all of us, and then we all got to see the great positives that each one of us had, which was, despite the outcome, we accomplished a tremendous amount, right? There was a small company of people, by the time we were in full bore execution mode, probably like 60 or 70 people, and we went from proving out a product in a beta market to lighting up 18 to 20 markets within a period of 12 months. And that included, supply chain, manufacturing, bunch of RF technologies, not counting dealing with lawyers. It included marketing, it included real estate acquisition. It was just a tremendous, so I think everybody saw this is a special team, and we loved working with each other. And Joe Lepowski, our CTO, and he was CTO at Aereo as well, we both looked at each other and like, we're kind of getting old, and recreating this group is going to take a lot of energy. Why don't we just we want to do this. This is a great idea. We think technically we're on to something really meaningful here, so let's just do it. So, And so literally it was at a Mexican restaurant, and I sort of sat down and poured tequila for everybody and said, so this is what we want to do, who's in?
Right. Well, when was that moment, like in the abrupt and gradual transitions from Aereo to Starry, when was that tequila moment?
So the line that got drawn was the day we filed for bankruptcy at Aereo.
Right.
And so we said, we're doing this. As a result, we're laying everybody off.
Yeah.
Here's a bottle of tequila. Who's in?
Yeah. So we're laying you off and founding a new company at the same moment.
Yeah, it was not we're laying you off. It was like everybody knew what was going on, right? It was a very transparent company in that sense.
Right.
Yeah.
So, you mentioned being kind of a full stack company. It seems in a way that your last maybe 12 years at least has been sort of slowly moving down the stack in terms of the technologies and the types of problems that you're addressing. So a lot of people might not realize that you founded and were the CEO for 9 years of a company acquired by Microsoft before going to Aereo,
right.
So Navic Networks. You were serving TV ads essentially.
Yep.
And doing analytics and intelligence on top of those ads. What was the experience like of running a company for 9 years, and then did you get comfortable to a certain extent, and did Aereo? How did the experience of the sort of like roller coaster ride of Aereo compare to 9 years of what you might say was much more stable operating?
It's never stable. It looks stable, right? So. Sure. 9 years of operations were really interesting because I was very lucky that we started in 2000, and then we raised financing right after the crash and all. It was absolute mayhem. But again, I don't know, maybe it's good fortune or good luck or I'm blessed or however you want to put it, but I had great investors, very supportive. I had great employees, and my management team was just excellent, bunch of young people. And we all buckled down. We turned the company cash flow positive between 2001 and 2004. And then it was just a grind. It was, you count every penny, and we grew cash flow from like, $1 million or $500,000 to like almost 12 million in free cash flow by the time we sold the company. So it looks stable, but you're working the phones for, AP every day, or, and we were in a very strange position. All the way up to 2007, we effectively had 4 customers. They were very large customers, multi-million-dollar accounts on an annualized basis. Every year, it was like, $30 million account here or $10 million account here. So, if one of those 4 people woke up on the wrong side of the bed, you were screwed.
Sure.
So you had to be on pins and needles, just praying every day that the phone doesn't ring with that, Stamford, Connecticut area code, right? Because that was like Time Warner Cable's headquarters at that point. Because you knew if corporate was calling, something really bad was going to go on, right? So,
right.
So no, it's never, it was different, but it's never, it appears, great, you're making a bunch. And I have close friends that run larger companies that generate, 200 million in free cash flow. And they're exact same problems, right? And it's like,
sure.
HR nightmare day one, or lawyer XYZ. It's just it almost sort of felt like when I was standing there when you were doing a show of hands. It felt like an AA meeting, right? who's here in recovery? But yeah, that's what we all sign up for.
Sure.
Hence your name.
The startup grind. Yeah, absolutely. How many were there people at Navic that have sort of stayed with you through Aereo and now Starry?
Yeah, multiple. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Neat. Is that, do you think that's core to actually, like one of the biggest unspoken things about working with startups and starting new companies is the people and building a team around you that you trust and that can move all in the same direction at the same time. Do you feel like having that consistency through all these different companies has been an advantage? Do you think that do you think the Aereo would be pretty similar? Do you think Starry would be pretty similar if there was a little more turnover?
It's never 100% the same group, right? Because it sounds a little callous, but you cull the herd in some ways, right? As you move to the next one, or some people of the herd decide that they don't want to deal with you anymore, and you're too intense, or you're too this or too that or whatever. All probably appropriate interpretations of their side too. So new blood always comes in, and Aereo, definitely there was a ton of new blood, including our CTO Joe, and he's sort of like one of my closest relationships, if you will. I call him Sunshine Joe because nothing ever bothers this guy. He's just incredible. He's an amazing. I mean, he's probably top 10 in the world or top 5 in the world in terms of his technical expertise in the areas that he's focused on. And then every time there's a set of new people that are contributing ideas. I think the biggest challenge is more of the sort of what I'll call the lead founders problem, which is how do you not make it about your idea, and how do you sort of get out of the way to let others flourish and lead, and it's not that you're not wanting to or you're not well intentioned. Habitually, you're just you're alpha dude or alpha dudette, whatever it is, right? You're sort of focused on making sure this is mine, or I want to do this. But it's great when you step out. And I had sort of a moment this past couple of weeks where there were a few aspects of the company that I was absolutely not involved in that turned out fabulous as from a launch perspective. And it was like a great moment of recognition, or just like hitting myself on the head and like, dude, you got to pay attention to this, Right. Get great people, provide them all the tools, resources, focus, direction, and get out of the way a little bit. So.
Yeah. You think it's a balance of exerting control versus producing freedom, or do you think, how would you actually, if you could translate that into something a little more general for people who might be starting a company for the first time, where do you draw that line, or where do you find
So how many
balance?
people actually in their business use a strategy? Yeah, you should all wipe that slate clean, absolutely. There is no strategy. So there's just none. I've had at least half a bourbon, so I'll say this out loud. So the Mongols had this great philosophy, which was Genghis Khan's approach. I don't know if this is true or not. It's like a random bunch of fictional books that I've read that have inspired this comment, which is the only strategy they had was kill. We know how to kill. The rest, everything is how to get high ground, right? Tactics matter. That's the best thing you can ever do, is get better at what you do today. So that's kind of how I tend to approach this, is don't overthink it. Don't, you have your true north. You set yourself up, you say, I want to provide the best X product, or I want to do the best X this, whatever is floating your boat. Right. But beyond that, don't.
So why provide internet? Why, was there specific technical expertise that you built with Aereo that you felt was aligned here, or where did that fundamental seed come from? Because it's a huge thing to tackle. You could argue it's you're taking on incumbents that may even be an order of magnitude bigger than the companies that sued you for Aereo. So why tackle?
It's a great business. Very simply, it's just an awesome business.
Yeah.
And if you can figure out in an awesome business to enter it without the legacy cost structure and provide an excellent product that lines up with or beats consumers' expectations, and you can then export that idea globally, I don't know where else you'd get that, right? It's probably the legal form of selling heroin. It really is. Where else what else can you sell that is required by the consumer every day, that has 90+% margin year in, year out, and increasing, and you're the only guy who can sell it? Mm-hmm. Well, doesn't get any better than that.
Right. So if it's such a big opportunity, why hasn't a company like Google or Facebook, who are both doing internet for everyone kind of initiatives, why wouldn't they tackle that market?
So they are. So obviously everybody knows Google Fiber. I mean, I'm not a Google insider,
But it's still wired internet, right?
It's still wired. And there's been a sort of conceptual approach towards wireless, which has been wireless is great for coverage, but not for throughput. So if you think about it, whether you have Project Loon type things or drones and all those kinds of things that are floating around, the idea is, and I think it lines up well, at least from a distance, from those businesses' perspective, which is as you drive coverage, your business benefits, right? To load a Facebook page, you don't need 200 megabits a second, right? You need 500 kilobits, whatever it is.
Right.
So it makes total sense to use wireless to drive coverage. So as we were thinking about it, and we said, okay, this is exciting business. It has a public service component or a public sentiment that we all align up with, right? I mean, all of us as people are really mission oriented, or we're focused on kind of like solving that in a fair, equitable way. An important access component comes into the consumer's house or in their lives. So we decided that in order to solve this, we had to think completely outside the box. And Joe is a wizard in a lot of these things, and he and I started talking about things, and it was pure happenstance in a lot of ways, where we said, well, hold on a second. These problems, these restrictions in these bans that have existed in the past have been solved. They've been solved for a very different set of reasons. Radars, for example, used very similar sets of technologies that we are using in communications. Why can't we just use those? So we said, why don't we just put 10 guys or 15 guys together and make a bunch of stuff and see what happens? And we did, and it worked, and so that was right. We're not alone in this. There's a bunch of people working in this whole area. In particular, if you think about 5G cellular, this is where foundationally where a lot of the technologies are. So it's a lot of it is, the level of compute power that's available, the level of radio technology that's available, the level of manufacturing technology, because as you get to these frequencies, how you manufacture, and I don't mean just the chips, how do you manufacture things like antennas becomes really, really critical, because platings are highly controlled, and you're like 1 or 2 microns into it's just a perfect storm of capabilities that are coming together.
You made a very conscious decision to base Aereo in New York City, which was excellent. You also have a very strong set of roots in Boston,
right?
Having gone to college there, and now you are launching Starry first in Boston. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about why launch it in Boston before going to other cities.
So Aereo was launched in New York for largely, we didn't know what the market or demographic dynamic was going to be. And we learned a lot of that, which has helped us at Starry as well. So it made a lot of sense to say, New York's such a large market, and it has a particular reception problem. So if you're living anywhere in Lower Manhattan, or frankly anywhere in Manhattan, you really can't receive over-the-top TV just because of the canyon effect, right? How essentially if you take a spectrum analyzer and you look at the UHF VHF band inside Manhattan, it looks like a coax. Everything is stacked every 6 megahertz. So there's so much multipath and so much interference. Reception wasn't necessarily a great option. So plus it's so large. Since we had no idea who our potential customer was, it was a classic, let's just go in a large pool, and I'm sure some fish will bite, right? So that was the approach.
Sure.
And then we met a lot of the team got built here on the marketing and government and PR side. In Boston is where all of our engineering is. Starry is a lot, I would probably say at least 2 or 3 orders more complicated technically. So it makes a lot of sense for our guys to just be able to drive to debug as opposed to fly to debug or take a train. But New York's like very much on, if as people probably have followed, we have some licenses from the FCC to do market tests.
Okay.
And New York is one of the markets that we're going to be launching the test in.
Okay. Was that a long process to get those licenses?
I don't think I'm qualified to answer that.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So was your Aereo tech team, engineering team, based in Boston, and now they've sort of stayed in that location?
Yes.
Okay. Got it. I wonder if we can.
And it's really,
Yeah.
a lot of people probably here deal with technology, but it's fascinating because we have, Node developers who are doing a lot of the sort of back office infrastructure. We've got iOS, Android developers. We've got firmware developers that work on, obviously very low level things. We've got digital hardware engineers. We've got analog RF hardware people. We've got mechanical engineers who are building all the enclosures and making the product look great. We've got industrial designers. This is as good as it gets. I mean, this is like a candy shop for me because it's, I stumble from like one desk to the other, and it's awesome.
Yeah. This interview would not do you justice and not be complete if we don't take a little step back and talk about where were you before Navic Networks? If you can just give us a little bit of the history of, if you can help us understand why you decided to start company after company to begin with, I think that would be interesting.
It probably isn't a surprise I hate authority. So having a boss is like the worst thing you could probably imagine for me.
You seem like an archetype of a nonconformist to some extent.
It's not purposeful. I mean, in all fairness, right? I mean, as a founder, a CEO, or a startup person, you have investors who are effectively your bosses, right? And you're required to perform for them. I just hate incompetent people in particular. I just don't suffer fools well. And I realized that very early on that, I was probably going to get fired, and I was going to be this disgruntled mid-level or low-level, engineer somewhere and just be mad at the world. And that was probably a realization I had when I was probably 20 or something like that. And it just made sense that, look, if you're passionate about building things, which is something very deep-rooted in me, the things that get me excited the most are like conceiving, building, taking it all the way to, and like visualizing and putting in front of people, and then most importantly, selling it, right? I love the idea of engaging with somebody one-on-one, convincing them that what I'm working or what I'm doing is interesting, useful, compelling. And so entrepreneurship filled all those sort of buckets for me. Money or process or prestige or being, having an office, none of those things ever interested me. So I'm happier doing all the former things, which is like conceiving, making, grinding it out with a bunch of guys to like make something tangible that's visible.
Was there a moment where you kind of discovered that passion? Was there, when did you first sort of feel that ignition and say, wow, like this is something that's...
That was actually very early on, probably 13 or 14. I used to make bookshelf speakers.
Yeah.
A little business doing that.
Okay, interesting.
In India, there was no Bose or any of these things, right? So you either had large speakers or you had like tinny, two-in-one type things.
Right.
And so a buddy of mine he was in college, and he started making amplifiers. Actually not that great, but they were amplifiers. And I started making speakers to go with the amplifiers, and we basically would sell them and make them, it's a good way to make money.
And was that something that lasted several years? Was it
probably a year and a half, yeah.
Okay.
Before the warranty ran out.
What was the next step from there? Where did you go from speakers?
Nothing. India, if you people of Indian origin or people who went to school in India will probably realize that once you get to like 10th grade, it's a total grind, right? You have to get into the right colleges, and it's basically a testing system. So it was nothing. It was just study. Yeah.
Okay. And how did you end up coming to the U.S.?
Graduate school.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. In Boston.
Yeah. So it's I think things are different now. This is early '90s, so the only thing I can afford was where they would give me a scholarship plus living expenses and things like that. So Northeastern was very kind to me, and
yeah.
offered me those things.
When a lot of people think of academia, they would think of sort of the opposite of entrepreneurship. You tend to write papers that might take you 8 years to write, whereas you could start 3 different companies in 8 years potentially. When you graduated, what was the next step from there?
I was actually getting a PhD because I wanted to teach. I love teaching because as a research assistant, or you teach class or 2 or whatever it is every semester, and so I love teaching.
Yeah.
But then I realized that the business of teaching was just terrible. You had to write papers and chase grants and do all this stuff. And I'm like, well, if you're going to do that, might as well get rich. So.
Do you feel like you've still been able to pursue a lot of those passions?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's partly why we do the kinds of things that we all collectively do, is because my day literally is ranges from review morning calls, which tend to be 2 or 3 hours starting at like 6 a.m., which are dealing with as issues as varied as antenna design, or how we're going to make something, or manufacturability of certain things, to consumer experience and what's going to work and what's not going to work, to regulatory strategy, it's just so I think in some ways it sort of fuels my ADD or inability to focus.
Sure. So for the record, if you have questions, please tweet them at StartupGrindNYC. Hashtag StartupGrindNYC. I do have my phone here, so we'll go ahead and poll. We have our first question here from Rustin Charles. Rustin, where are you? Hey, Rustin, how's it going? So Rustin has a particular question. You stated you had no idea who your potential customer was. I assume this is for Aereo? For Starry?
All of the above, yeah.
So you stated you had no idea who your potential customer was. How do you market a product without knowing that?
So, a friend of mine sort of taught me that you can create your own set of categories, and then nobody else can play your game except yourself, and then everybody else has to come and compete with you. So you define the experience. At least this is how we tend to do things. When we started Aereo, everybody said, well, broadcast TV, who knows about broadcast TV anyways, who cares? Although 70% of the viewership happens to be on broadcast TV. So we redefined the category, created a completely new way of sort of positioning it, and then marketed that position, and which effectively led to lots and lots, hundreds of thousands of consumers that came. So that's how I tend to think about it. Is like, if you're going to play somebody else's game, it doesn't really matter. Who do you know? The best person you know is you and your team. So take an intersection set of you and your team's, personality, in terms of what do you like about the product that you're building, why are you building it, create that as a category, and then just market that sensibility as opposed to worrying about who these people are, where to find them, where not to find them. You're marketing the idea, as opposed to trying to say, I need 8 men, 18 to 24, that live in 2-bedroom apartments that do X, Y, Z. Right? That's just a losing game.
Well,
That's Coca-Cola.
I suppose when you have a mass consumer product, you have a little more leeway to sort of put it out to a broad audience and see what comes back to you.
I don't think it's a mass consumer product or not. I think my personal view, and this is purely a personal view and not an indictment of any other perspective, is I only do things that I want to do, right? I only build things that I want. I don't build something that I think you might want, but I don't necessarily want.
Yeah. So you're an anti-politician in a sense. You aren't going out and taking a poll to see, what people are asking
that's
for.
What's incredibly wrong with the entire system today, right? It just, I know it sort of sounds like a broken record, but Apple does that, right? And I think a lot of companies do that to some extent. Sometimes works, sometimes it doesn't work, but I don't know what else to base it on. If you're a gamer, this is the kind of game I want to build and I want to play, so I'm going to make that game. And I'm betting on the fact that I'm not the only human being in this world that likes this.
Marketing to yourself.
Effectively, right? You're marketing to your sensibility of saying, like, these are the things that appeal to me.
Do Do you think, so when you first put something out there, yeah.
Which is a terrible thing to say to an investor, by the way. It's awful. I have no answer. Most of the investors are like, they went to an MBA school and they have all the data charts and this and that, which is all like hindsight, right? Because it's so easy to detect signal out of noise in retrospect. How do you forecast that? I think it's made up.
Well, what story did you tell to investors with Starry after the very public experience of Aereo? I mean, you can choose not to answer the question, but
No, I'm happy to, because a good number of you will hopefully never go to the Supreme Court, but will likely fail, which is part of the process. It is what it is, right? And I don't mean that in a glorifying way, that it's great to fail and we'll restart. No, it sucks to fail, but but it's just statistically what ends up happening. Now I will sound like a politician because it comes down to your record, right? Mm-hmm. If all your investors, they're all intelligent people, they're all looking for interesting deals, right? That's just what it is. What they're really looking for is not how good or bad the idea is. This is, again, a personal view of mine. But really, can you get done what you say you're going to get done? Because beyond that, do you have the ability to recognize market signals that are coming? Do you have the ability to optimize against the market signals that are coming? And can you get it done?
Right.
And I think I didn't have to ask or make this case. All of my investors said, you hit every milestone. That may largely because I've had milestones, but that's a separate thing.
So we have another question from Ryan Sommer. Ryan, how's it going? Good. His question is, he's curious to hear more of your thoughts on Loon, internet.org versus more altruistic plays like OuterNet or OneWeb.
Loon.
So Project Loon is
Loon.
Google's.
How do you see the internet coming to the developing world? Do you think that companies like Facebook and Google are required for that, or do you see innovation and hope for more sort of optimistic and non
It's a...
So to quickly repeat for the audience, you're essentially saying that Google's Project Loon and Facebook have some bias because they're coming from these private companies.
Correct.
Is there a hope that there's more altruistic opportunity for the third world to get internet?
I actually, and this is again a personal view, I don't own any shares in Facebook or Google or any of those things. I'm not related to any of these. I actually do think that they come from the right place in heart. I understand there's a policy issue in those things. This is sort of the sad nature of the world that we live in, right? That the governments who tax people are incapable of spending on basic things and deploying capital in the appropriate way and getting in that, and be it healthcare. So the question, then you take a step back and you say the Gates Foundation essentially single-handedly taking on malaria throughout vast portions of Africa, and the African subcontinent and the Indian subcontinent, has made a tremendous dent. Is that altruistic? Okay, just because it's called a foundation doesn't necessarily mean that's a private individual that's essentially doing this, remarkable work. So until governments do this, I think people with means will always be incented for right and wrong reasons. I just don't see a system emerging in which governments are doing anything. It's disappointing, it's disheartening, but I don't see what the end is, right? I think there are some exciting things in Europe that have happened. I think some parts of Yugoslavia and those countries, the Baltic countries have done some stuff. Japan, Korea are great examples where broadband access is almost universal. I think people in Italy are struggling with, like, are we going to dig up streets of ancient Rome to lay fiber or not? And I don't know who's right or wrong, right? It's would you want 2,000-year-old architecture, or do you want faster internet?
Do you feel in any sense like Starry is doing the job that the government is not capable of doing in terms of providing access?
I don't know if it's the government. That's not the American way, right? I mean, this is kind of how I look at it. I mean, the only reason I'm in this country is because there was like an advertising that said, right, come to America, do good, work hard, awesome.
Yeah.
So
Freedom,
this was
freedom,
great.
liberty.
Yeah, freedom,
success.
liberty, exactly. Nobody told me about the religion part, but that's like a separate. I think a lot of people sympathize with that. That's not the American model. I mean, we've been outsourcing before Halliburton, right? Cornelius Vanderbilt was supplying ships to the Union Navy, so this has been going on for hundreds of years at this point. It's worked. It's not for everybody. It's not for every country, but that's not the American model. So I don't think we're filling a void that nobody else is filling. I think we're just kind of moving the bar forward because it's something new, it's an exciting market, and it's available. So why not?
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned ships. It reminds me that your dad was a ship captain.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. What was your interaction with that? I mean, were you traveling with him? Were you actually?
Every now and then in the summer. I actually, on my 10th birthday, had the unique moment of plucking a tooth out in the Mississippi River under the bridge over New Orleans and actually handling I think that it was a 50,000-ton bulk carrier going down for like 30 microseconds, but yes.
Wow, all right. So in Mississippi, that must have had...
In New Orleans, Mississippi River, yeah.
Yeah, Mississippi River. Did that influence your perspective on America, to be essentially a kid sort of like traveling on a ship through...
Oh, it was fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, it must have been.
They had ice cream everywhere.
Ice cream everywhere. They have ice cream on the ship?
Everywhere. You have no idea, outside the United States, ice cream doesn't exist in that liberal form. We have sandwiches of ice cream. It's just
Okay.
so attractive.
What was your perspective of America before actually living in America?
Always incredibly positive. At least, the reason I ended up in Boston was actually a really funny story. So I grew up in a small town called Bhopal, India, which, if you guys look up, sad story, Union Carbide, a bunch of people died, which is an American corporation, didn't affect my view of the U.S. But in I forget the year, 82 or 84, I was a kid, and we hosted the Asian Games in India. And black and white television first came to India at that point, and it was a highly regulated environment, so it was 3 hours only in the evenings, because that was deemed appropriate by the government. I have no idea why you just couldn't run the stupid transmitter the entire time, but that was at one channel.
Yeah.
And it was very programmed. It was very pro-Soviet in a lot of ways, but so there was a lot of documentaries and a lot of this and a lot of that. But one of the documentaries they had was the life of JFK. So that just like set the hook for me for Boston, because of course this amazing person. So
Yeah.
so I always had this like great interpretation of what America was, and
Yeah.
I still do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not the presidential election notwithstanding, but yes.
Great. So we haven't actually gotten that many questions on Twitter this time around. So I assume that there are a lot of people who have better questions than I do out there. We're going to take some hands. Yeah, right here.
How do you choose your partners and take that lead with them when you're starting something up? And how do you do it in a way that if it doesn't work out, that you're able to split in a new way?
So it's a really excellent question, because it's like, it's the equivalent of saying, negotiating a prenup. I've never done that, right? But that's kind of the equivalent of what we're talking about. I've had the good and bad fortune of having picked partners who, and I'll tell you emotionally kind of how when you're young and whenever you are, the excitement of starting a company is so profound, because it's finally what you wanted to do, right? Or getting together with people. You only hope for the optimist view. You never figure out kind of who's doing what. And the one thing, much like any relationship, I will tell you, is certain: people will change. Some will grow at a different pace than some others will, right? So my first real company, I fired one and took all his stock back because there was a lot of bad behavior. I fired the second one, bought her stock for $1 million, and decided that day I will never have a co-founder. And then I met my current team at Aereo, and I sort of realized what a absolutely lonely journey I had lived, because there was no person that I could actually, like really share. You can't do this with your spouse or your girlfriend or wife, right? Because they got enough other problems. You got children, you got this, or who knows whatever else, right? I mean, you want to have a moment of peace at home. So you need a work spouse, and those tend to be your co-founders. If you're the CEO, you have to have a certain amount of sort of boundaries around, how much hair you want to let down on a given day. But I think the best thing is to actually do the prenup. It's a tough conversation, and I think that conversation will probably tell you if you want to be in bed with this person or not. Having said that, we started Aereo, and I never had that conversation with anybody. Because I think I felt like I had already seen these people in the line of fire. I had seen these people with battle lines drawn. It's not a luxury most people have, right? It's not. So I felt like I got a pass this time because I didn't have to do that. And I'm hopeful that if I ever do this again, it's a similar set of people that I don't have to worry about it. But I think if you're just getting together, you have to have the prenup conversation. Because if you don't today, I don't know what stage you're at, seed or the first seed investor that'll come in will put that in. More importantly, the bigger problem is going to be, and this may be a little sort of troubling when I say this, not only will they do that with a co-founder, they might as a result do it with you as well, right? So there'll be a bunch of buyback provisions and a bunch of like reharvesting provisions. I mean, I know a bunch of VCs that actually have a index in their deck for their LPs that say, this is the amount of founder equity we harvested, right? I mean, this is the level of stupidity that goes around. So you have to be cautious about that. But I do that, especially if it's somebody that you're just getting to work with.
So going back to Twitter, we have a question from Amit. Hey, Amit, how's it going? His question is, do you think cord cutting is finally real? And if so, what do you think the inflection point was?
I think it is absolutely real. I think recent numbers are like 12 million, 15 million homes, somewhere in that range. So it's, I don't think there's an inflection point. There's no trigger point. I think these are generational changes.
Yeah.
I think people are coming of age, and the old model just doesn't fit anymore, and it's just going. I would love to sit here and say, we had something to do with it, and I think we've probably caused a lot of, hubbub in the press, but I think it's a generational change.
So your Starry's customer is most likely the Bernie Sanders generation, sort of young liberal person.
The problem is like, who's going to pay the bill? Government? I don't know.
Right. Yeah. Let's take a question from the back.
Hi, my name is Micah Brown. I've got a question around adjacent markets related to the devices that you use to support your business model, and also if you could talk a little bit about the technology that actually goes into enabling what you're doing in terms of the device that goes into the household that's being enabled. Is there a supply chain problem in terms of the specific types of hardware that are used to enable you to do what you're doing? You talked about antennas and microsecond delays and some of these things in relation to the type of materials that go into the hardware that you're using. And if there is there an adjacent market there? Is that like a whole area of business that's going to change as kind of the materials that are used change over the next couple of years?
All right, that was a few questions.
I think the question is the kinds of technologies we're using, do they cause supply chain problems? And if so, are there adjacent businesses in that? Is that a good summary? So I guess a big admission, supply chain is one of the hardest things you can ever do. It's scary, it's so complex, it's so technical, it is so jurisdictionally dependent. I mean, for example, what certain types of radios can be exported but not imported. They can be reworked in Mexico but not in Canada because of certain treaty rules, and the list is just infinite. So it's an incredibly complex part of the food chain. I mean, I guess that's why Tim Cook runs Apple, right? It's just what it is. I don't, I'm sure there is an ancillary or adjacent sort of business line in that. My sense is that there is, it smells a little like, and I don't know this, we're actually, if anybody's looking for a VP of supply chain job, please find me. We are looking for one. It smells a little like television media buying to me. It is incredibly complicated. As a result, people have very homegrown expertise in very nuanced, small, narrow areas. And as a result, institutionally, nobody's willing to replace them, right? So if I'm contract manufacturer X, I know which port and which ferry guy is going to be on time because the tide comes in blah, right? And I know which container handler will get some. This is the level of nuance that you end up sort of dealing with, and I don't know how you sort of codify all that in maybe some fancy AI system someday, but I think it's a very difficult.
Well, Starry is also building multiple devices right from the outset, right? You're building a consumer device, and then you're building your own devices to build a network. So that's, I believe, at least 3 different devices that you're building right off the bat, which I assume
3 that we've announced.
Sure. Yeah.
Right.
Fair enough. Yeah. So I'll ask a selfish consumer question, which is, when do you think you'll be in New York City?
I think once we get comfortable, stable in Boston, then I think, yeah.
Yeah. So you're essentially using Boston as a test market. You are looking for exactly who those customers are going to be. How do you determine the point at which you're comfortable with scaling beyond one city to start looking at multiple cities?
It's just like pornography. You know it when you see it. That's just what it is. It's what it is.
Nice.
I mean, you have a good sense. I mean, your peers tell you.
Sure.
They're no longer having nervous breakdowns. The morning call. No, it's just you just have to monitor those things. And like, okay, things are, people
settled
are
enough that you
settled enough that they seem like they're
mix everything up again.
exactly, yeah.
From the front here.
I'm very curious about.
There's a mic here for you.
Thank you. I'm very curious about your thinking about the strategy, because I heard you say a few examples about Genghis Khan, that it was all about tactics, but even just knowing something about Genghis Khan, I think he was using some strategy as well. And the biggest strategy was probably speed and fear, right? And the same goes with Sun Tzu, who used to say that the battle is won even before it starts, right? And I understand your position not overthinking and not over-analyzing, but besides tactics, what is your thinking on strategy? I assume you don't just completely discard it.
I think you're right not to oversimplify this, right? But I think what I'm trying to say is people get wrapped around the axle a lot in trying to
Building a
optimize
50-business
things
plan.
that are not relevant in the name of strategy. The fact that you have to create a PowerPoint presentation for 4 hours that has the word strategy on it is a bloody waste of time. You should be out calling on a customer or answering a customer's call or whatever else, right? Because that's going to teach you more about the drivers, the assumptions in your business than anything else, right? So I think there's a time and place. If you're General Electric, I'm sure strategy makes sense because you've got a whole treasury department that goes to take care of, how currency hedges are going to work in the next 5 years or whatever it happens to be. But beyond that, I think if you are a company, so for me, a strategy statement would be, we will be the best X product. And then rest everything is like, how do we get to the best X product, right?
Just a small follow-up, but I assume you do some basic research on the markets and I guess the target market or who the product will appeal to, at least on a basic level, right?
So I think that was the gentleman's question behind you, which was, you can't guess all that, right? So you basically say, I think this is what I want to buy.
You can
How
guess,
many
but
of
you'd be
those?
wrong.
Yeah, you can guess it, but you'll be wrong. The only thing you know is, I've got a team of 50 people. This is what I want to buy. How many of you will buy this? Okay, we got like 3 out of 50 or 5 out of 50 saying, this is kind of cool, I'd buy that. Okay, you got 10% acceptance in that. It's a sample. It's a biased sample, for sure, but it's a sample. So that's how and then we basically say, okay, can we market that sensibility? Can we market that idea?
Let's take one last question, and then we'll go into just sort of individual pitches from the audience. Anyone else have a question for Chet? Yeah, right here.
My only question was when. So in terms of drawing up contracts for this premarital agreement, do you do it right away, or do you take some time to work with the person? Because why go through all the trouble of drawing up contracts if you don't even know if it's worth it?
So I think absolutely correct. But it's like any relationship, right? And I don't mean to be cynical about this, but you kind of have to be, right? And you don't have to be like overtly cynical in your approach, but there are test marks all along the way, right? How well does this person deal with criticism, or how do they deal with feedback? How do they deal with the idea of stress or a deadline? How enthusiastic are they about giving up personal time? How are they, do they encourage you when you're having a bad day, or do you encourage them when you're there having a bad day, right? So those are all what I will call relationship markers. Those are pretty obvious in like 2, 3, 4 weeks. And if they're not obvious, you should create situations that make them obvious.
So you have to date them before you agree
That's
to get
exactly
married.
right.
Yeah. Great. So again, if you've never been to a startup grind before, we always love to hear what people from the audience are working on. It's not so much, the idea is not that you're pitching Chet on
Can I just finish one more thing?
Please.
If they have a significant other, have drinks or dinner with them. This is a funny story. So Joe, our CTO, when we were starting out at Aereo, and we were both grown men at this point, right? So we were kind of, and he's, so we started talking, and Joe's a lot more, he's 10 times smarter than I am. So we had lunch a few times, and I was actually pitching him to be my advisor. And then one day he calls up and he's like, this is kind of really interesting. I think I want to do this. I'm like, great. Will you advise me? He was like, no, I want to do this. I want to join. I'll put some money in too with you. I'm like, okay, great. He said, but one condition, Diane wants to meet your wife. So Diane and Joe came over for dinner, and I took my 2 absolutely crazy unruly children for dinner, and it's been so. People can hide themselves, so they can't hide who they are friends with, who they have relationships with, and I think that's just part of your diligence.
So unfortunately, that's all the time we have. We do have plenty of time for you to stick around, though. We're going to be here until at least 9:30, I think. So feel free to grab another beer from the fridge, stick around, meet the people around you, say hi. We do have to thank Pivotal for hosting us, as well as the Devon Group. Raise your hand one more time. If you have any PR questions, they are wonderful. Please go talk to them, as well as Fiverr. The last thing we really want to do is have all the event team come up to the front. We really want to give these guys a big round of applause again, because they're so generous with their time and helping the whole thing come together. So thank you very much to them. Please, if you do have any bottles or cans, please pick them up. We're going to go ahead and remove all the chairs. We're going to do a quick selfie up here with Chet. And then please do stick around. We still have another hour in the space. And the fridges are open.